How are you? Hello.
Okay, hi. Okay. Let's see. Okay, can you hear me, John?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay.
Perfect.
All right. It is recording.
Oh, we don't need to. We can probably.
It was set to record automatically.
Oh, shoot.
Yeah.
I think we can restart it though. We should be able to. Are you able to make me a code? We are gonna give folks a little bit of time to trickle in here, just a couple minutes. Welcome, welcome. Thanks everyone for being with us. Good to see folks. Good to see some familiar faces, some new faces. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being with us. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get things started. I am somewhat of your MC or host for the evening, although we don't need to be too formal about it. Welcome, everyone. It is good to have everyone here. Welcome, especially on behalf of the Daniel Berrigan Collective. My name is John Noble. My pronouns are he and him. I am one of the steering committee members who's here on the call tonight. Other steering committee members, can you go ahead and give a wave so folks know who you are? We've got Anna Brown, we've got Kathy O'Leary, we've got Bill Wiley Kellerman. And it is our pleasure to welcome you all to this conversation tonight that I believe, although I don't have the graphic in front of me, we are calling Responses to Settler Regimes. So the Dan Berrigan Collective is an organization grounded in the life and the mission, the vision of Daniel Berrigan, specifically around the goals of contemplation, of community, of resistance. This organization promotes the person, thought, and legacy of activism of Daniel Berrigan, S.J. We come out of the tradition promoted by Berrigan, in which contemplation, reflection, and study flow into and from community, activism, and resistance. We provide space for dialogue between the writings of Daniel Berrigan and contemporary communities of resistance that share his concerns and expand them. We center the experiences and concerns of women, people of color, younger people, LGBTQ plus people, immigrants, the incarcerated, and those who have difficulty finding a voice in academic, religious, and social institutions. And we strive and are continuing to strive to be as accessible as possible and to use a variety of media, writing, art, music, poetry, celebrations, and social media. So the goal of our conversation tonight with our two wonderful speakers is to respond to a speech that Dan Berrigan gave in 1973. And in our planning for this, I found out that it's been called by many authors many things, but I think we settled on it being called Covenant and Conquest at some point or another. So we're going to land there this evening and say that we're responding to a 1973 speech by Dan called Covenant and Conquest. So Bill, I believe, was the one who brought us excerpts from Covenant and Conquest to one of our steering committee meetings in mid-October. And we found this speech, which we will certainly drop the entirety of in the chat. And I would encourage each of you to take some time with it, to think about it, to read it in depth at your own pace, although it is very long. We found it to be astonishingly relevant in our own reading and prophetic for today's context, particularly of the context of the genocide that we're seeing unfolding in Gaza. So after thinking about this, after wondering how do we respond to this speech, we came to the conclusion that we, as the steering committee, would not respond to this speech, but that we would invite partners in who could respond to this speech with us, who could bring Dan Berrigan's thought and writing into a contemporary context, and to wonder and to poke and prod and ask hard questions and celebrate and challenge this speech as is needed. So we have two wonderful speakers who are here to do that with us tonight. And they are Huwaida Arraf and Marc Ellis. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce each of those folks. Then we're going to have members of the steering committee sort of go around and share excerpts from the speech. Then I'm going to invite Marc and Huwaida respectively to respond to the speech, to ask questions, to share what they might want to share. And then we'll move into some ongoing conversation and questions. So first of all, we have with us tonight Huwaida Arraf, who is a Palestinian-American civil and human rights attorney and social justice activist. She has been involved in legal and grassroots initiatives for Palestinian rights for the past 2 decades, including co-founding the Nobel Peace Prize-nominated International Solidarity Movement and leading the Free Gaza movement, which organized sea voyages to Gaza to confront and challenge Israel's illegal blockade on the 2 million Palestinians living there. Huwaida was one of the primary organizers of the Gaza Freedom Flotilla and was traveling with it when it was lethally attacked by Israeli forces on May 31st, 2020. Huwaida was a 2020 delegate to the Democratic National Convention and a 2022 candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives for Michigan's 10th Congressional District. So welcome, Huwaida. We are glad that you're with us tonight. We also have with us Marc Ellis, who is a liberation theologian, a prolific writer on Israel-Palestine, and I do mean prolific when I say that word, and a retired university professor of Jewish studies, professor of history, and director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Baylor University. His writings include Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation and his latest, First Light, Encountering Edward Said and the Late-Style Jewish Prophetic in the New Diaspora, which includes many words that I thought I was going to trip over when I was doing his introduction. So I think I made it through that. So I'm going to invite members of the steering committee to share, by way of our opening prayer, by way of our opening reflection, to share some excerpts from Covenant and Conquest. And I'll invite each of us into a space of reflective listening and wondering as we do that. And I just realized that I think I said I would start, so I'm going to pull up my excerpts document. From Covenant and Conquest, October 19th, 1973. I come before you this evening, a non-expert in every field of human expertise, including the subject you have invited me to explore. I wish to include also in my field of inexpertise my own religious tradition. I am a non-expert Christian by any conceivable standard. This admission is in the interest of both clarity of mind and of moral conduct. I am interested, as a Christian, in one thing, in so simple a thing as sane conduct in the world. The experts in my tradition, the theologians, the biblical scholars, and by and large, the hierarchy, go in another direction than mine.
Sane conduct in the world. Let me explain. I do not believe it is the destiny of human flesh to burn, and for that I am in trouble, as are my brother and my friends to this day. I do not believe that a violin concerto, however immortal in execution, is the proper comfort to offer a napalmed child. I believe that the fiddler should come down from the roof, put his violin aside, take up an extinguisher, raise a cry of alarm, break down the intervening door. I will not begin by taking sides, nor indeed will I end by taking sides, which is to say, I am sick of wars hot and cold, of all their metaphors and deceits and ideological ruses. I am sick of the betrayal of the mind and the failure of compassion and the neglect of the poor. I am sick of secretaries of state and their works and pomps and peace prizes. I am sick of torture and secret police and the apparatus of fascists and the rhetoric of leftists, like Lazarus staggering from his grave, or the ghost of Trotsky. I can only groan. We have had enough of that. We have been through all that.
Bill, yeah.
Sorry. When I received an invitation to address you some months ago, I winced. Another crisis? If the nerve ends of Israelis and Arabs were raw, so were mine. More, why should I enter your yard on a cleanup project when my own, American, was a moral shantytown? And the war broke, and I winced again, and very nearly begged off. Then a better second thought occurred, something like this. If it was important to speak up while a non-war, at least an absence of war, held, then why not when a war broke? Indeed, did not the need for dispassion, and reason and courage increase when the guns were cutting down whatever sanity remained? If the first casualty of war was the truth, might it not be important to prevent, at least on one scene, that mortal casualty from occurring?
If I seem to concentrate upon the conduct of Israel, it is for reasons which to me, at least, are profound, of long pondering, and finally inescapable. It is not merely because my government, which has brought endless suffering to the world, is supporting Israel. The reasons go deeper and strike harder. They are lodged in my soul, in my conception of faith and transcendent, in the vision Jews have taught me of human conduct. To put the matter as simply as I know how, I am paying an old debt. It is a debt of love, more properly, a debt of outraged love.
A common assumption exists in the West, buttressed by massive historical and religious argument, to the effect that Israel is exempt from moral criticism. Her people have passed through the Gentile furnace. How then shall the Goy judge the suffering servant? And is not the Holocaust the definitive argument for the righteousness of this people, heroically determined to begin again in a promised land, that experiment in survival which so nearly went awry, so often under such constant assault at our hands? In such a way, Christians yield to Israel the right to her myths, to indulge them, to enlarge them, to live by them, even to call them biblical truths. If the Jews are indeed the people of promise and Israel the land of promise, then it must follow that God has willed the two to coincide. The means, they are swallowed up in the end. They disappear into glory.
Kathy?
And if the means include domestic repression, deception, cruelty, militarism, and if the classic refugee people is creating huge numbers of refugees, and if technological warfare has become the instrument of expansion and preemptive warfare the instrument of so-called peace, and if this people, so proud, so endowed with intelligence and artistry, so purified by suffering, sends its military missionaries into parts of the world where the people are bleeding under the heel of jackboots, Israeli military advisors in Iran, Israeli military advisors in Ethiopia, and if these advisors, that cruel euphemism under whose guise America kindled the Vietnam Holocaust, and if these advisors are sought and hired because Israelis have become as skilled in the fashioning of espionage and violence as ever were their oppressors, are such means as these swallowed in glory? Or do they stick in the throat of those who believe, as Judaism taught the world to believe, thou shalt not kill?
We had known Jewish communities that were alike to the Gentiles, that were persecuted, all but erased, that remained merciful, eloquent, prophetic. But something new was occurring before our eyes. The Jews arose from the Holocaust, a cause of universal joy, but the Jews arose like warriors, armed to the teeth. They took possession of a land. They exiled and destroyed old Arab communities. They, a minority, imposed the harshest minority laws on those who were once the majority of citizens. Then they flexed their muscles like the Goyim, the idolaters, the inhabitants of this earth, like Babylon and Egypt and Assyria, like those kingdoms which Israel's own prophet summoned to judgment. Israel entered the imperial adventure. She took up the imperial weapons. She spread abroad the imperial deceptions.
My concluding word is addressed especially to the Arab people. My critique of you is ultimately my critique of Israel. Both of you have ignored your historical symbols, but in different ways. Israel has betrayed her exodus by turning into a military conquest, and you have responded in kind, equally blind, equally vain. And what else could you do? Iqbal Ahmad, one of your most creative minds, has suggested a massive, worldwide reversal of symbols. What if the Arab peoples throughout the world were to raise a great cry after the manner of Gandhi, Martin King, Chavez? What if your cry became, "Let my people go"? What if your peoples were on the roads of the world, knocking at the doors of the embassies of Russians, Americans, Israelis, demanding a ceasefire, demanding repatriation, and at the same time, taking into account the fears of the Jewish community, welcoming her peoples to your side, breaking the iron circle, which condemns both sides, Israelis and Arabs alike, to dealing and to death?
I want us to take just a few moments of silence to let those words sit with us just as they do. And I think so many of those words offer us challenge, offer us something that feels prophetic, maybe relevant to our own context. I'm particularly thinking of where we see imperial adventure, imperial weapons, imperial deceptions that our own nation funds, what we do, what we continue to support. And to talk with us about that, but mostly to talk with us about this speech, I'm excited to welcome back Marc Ellis. And Marc, I want to invite you to maybe start off your section just by talking a little bit about your connection to Dan Berrigan, because you do have a unique connection to Dan Berrigan and to this speech. I'm wondering if you could share that a little with us.
Well, I certainly do, and I'm very grateful for your collective in bringing Berrigan back to me. I had read that speech, but reread it, of course, when you asked me. And it turns out that I met Dan, Father Berrigan, as I knew him, right after he returned from his trip to the Middle East, which was right after he had made his speech. In 1974, I was a young student at Florida State University in Tallahassee. And we had a tradition there in religious studies of bringing speakers in. And after they gave their lecture, we would have a reception where faculty and students could meet people who gave the lecture. And so I was used to it, but the speaker before Father Berrigan was William Stringfellow, which is also an interesting connection. And I had to listen to Stringfellow standing at the door because I came in late. And he was talking on the book of Revelation, which I could not figure out at all. And then he was whisked away to a faculty home, which prevented students from going there. And I complained about it. And a very nice faculty member assigned me the task then of taking Father Berrigan around and getting some students so we could meet him before his speech. But nobody wanted to go with me. So I took him in my mother's car, which was a blue Chevrolet Camaro, which was quite sporty at the time, light blue. And we went out to a cypress swamp outside of Tallahassee with wooden paths that you could walk around. And I spent about an hour and a half or so with Father Berrigan. I'd never been near a priest before. And there I am with a famous priest, and I'm Jewish, of course, as you said. And he had just returned. And the other part of it is I had been in Israel in October of 1973 on a dare from my Hebrew school teacher, who, when I mentioned Palestinians, got very upset that I even talked about them. And there I was then talking with Father Berrigan about this speech and his experience in the Middle East. I remember very little of my participation in it because I was overwhelmed by him. But I'll give you something typical of Berrigan himself. First of all, the things I remember are this. He mentioned Arafat with a gun in his holster. And he was very dismissive of that. I must have told him that I was Jewish, and I must have told him that I had been in the war, during the war in Israel. But I can't remember what. Anyway, here's what happened. I was supposed to bring him back. I'd been assigned this great privilege of taking Father Berrigan out that no one else wanted to go to. And I was assigned to get him back at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock for the faculty presentation with my teacher, Richard Rubenstein, who was a Holocaust theologian. And so I said, Father Berrigan, it's been very interesting talking with you, but it's time for us to leave. And Father Berrigan said, who says so? I thought to myself, well, the faculty, I started to perspire. I was nervous. I had this obligation. He said, I prefer talking with you. And as you know, probably if you've been around Father Berrigan, he liked to be fashionably late. And so we arrived 15, 20 minutes late. And I remember the room just as it was. This is 50 years ago now. And there was an aisle down the middle and two podiums with Rubenstein and Berrigan and an audience on both sides. And I wanted to disappear. But Father Berrigan wasn't going to have anything of that. And as I tried to disappear as we arrived, he grabbed my arm, hooked it, and walked up the center aisle with me. So that was the first time I was ever around a priest for any time. I had no idea what the priesthood was like or what Catholics were like. I was just being introduced to Catholicism. And he treated me not only as an equal, but somebody that he preferred talking to. And then in the 70s at the Catholic Worker, where I went, because my professor was also William Miller, who wrote a biography of Dorothy Day, I would meet him periodically when he said Mass at the Worker and was invited to his Jesuit residence for dinner. This was in the 1970s. And then when I was invited to teach at Maryknoll, I used to invite him to my center, my Institute for Justice and Peace, and we would spend quite a bit of time together. So these are very interesting memories for me, and they bring back a closeness and an entry into the Catholic world, which was quite different than most people have, even Catholics have. I also remember that a Jesuit that I said, are you going to come here, Father Berrigan, said to me in the church where I was reading A Harsh and Dreadful Love on Dorothy Day, he belongs in prison. So I knew something was up. Now, reading this speech, it's typical Berrigan. It is so poetic, but it has everything in there. It's amazing what, and the speech was before he went there. So he covered a lot of bases that I later covered, well, just really 10 years later, in my book, Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation. And the thing that struck me in rereading it now is how he presented himself as a Jew. Now, this is a recurring theme which I've written about, but I had forgotten that Berrigan did this, a Jew in relation to America and a Jew in a relation to the church, and how that must have made the Jewish community extremely angry, not only his position, but the fact that he would have the temerity to say, you know, really, I'm the Jew around here. But he was doing it, of course, as Berrigan would, in a provocative way, saying to Jews, where are you? We need you. And so I read this speech as a provocation, but also as lament. Now, this is what Edward Said did when he claimed to be the last cosmopolitan Jew. So we have this now history of people who are wondering where Jews have gone and where the prophetic voice has gone, not as a way of slamming us, but as a way of asking us the root of the global prophetic, Jewish, our indigenous, the prophetic, Jewish, what has happened to you as a people? And that's how I read the speech.
You talked a little bit about, you shared some of the context, you shared what jumped out to you. I appreciate those dual poles there of I think you said provocation and lament. And I'm wondering if there's specific provocations or specific laments within the speech or within Berrigan's work that jumped out to you upon that reread.
Yeah, this is Cornell West too. I remember when I first wrote Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation. This was before he was famous. I gave a talk with him, and he was reticent. He also responded to me, but was reticent. And I asked him later why he was so reticent. He was so indebted to the Jewish prophetic tradition as an African American that he just couldn't get his mind to do that. He couldn't wrap his mind around what happened. And Berrigan, again, we have this transition. The Catholic Church, we had persecuted, ghettoized, we know the history, and denigrated Jews exactly for that tradition, and then claimed it. He was now associating himself with it as a persecuted person within America and the church. That this reversal of what a Catholic would claim, who in the world, what Catholic in the 15th century or the 18th century or the 19th century would say, hey, I'm a Jew, who are you? But it was also about the reversal of the Jewish condition, where even if he romanticizes it to some extent, has a point that we were a demilitarized, pacifist, somewhat anarchist, prophetic group of rabble rousers who had survived it all, including his church, and now had become warriors, not only in Israel and Palestine, but around the world, which I also cataloged in 1987 and then beyond in my Tour to Jewish Theology of Liberation. So his thing about imperialism, colonialism, arms merchants, security experts, he's asking us in this provocative speech, what the hell is going on with you? Where have you gone? We need you. And I think that's what he saw in me. And I don't know why he saw it in me, because I can't recollect the thing from my initial encounter, except it was intense. Long hair, army jacket, the whole thing, 1974. That's what jumps out at me.
I think
But
it points to, oh, go ahead.
But this is what angered the Jewish community. And of course, he broke in the Vietnam circles, anti-Vietnam War circles. There were a lot of Jews, but the Jewish establishment had gone not favoring it, but going quiet on it, because when you have the American government guaranteeing the security of Israel, you need to be quiet. And there was a whole tradition of theology, what I call Holocaust theology, which developed, which diminished and tried to banish the prophetic, because they knew ultimately the prophetic would come home. And it has. They couldn't take the prophetic out of Jewish. They saw it as a threat to the state of Israel, the empowerment of it, and the abuse of it, the abuse of power within Israel. So Berrigan touched of sore points. I mean, I would say he's touched them all. But what's interesting, I was trying to find out historically, because I didn't know it, if he had visited when I was in Israel, Palestine in October 1973. And then I heard back, he had not even been there when he gave the speech. Where did he get this information? How did he discern it? Not, some of it he could get. But the points that he makes about it, including internal aspects of Israeli oppression, the Palestinian situation, the situation of other parts of the Middle East, spot on. So it's really remarkable. Often Dan would, in my view, get so poetic you could lose him. But this was a very concise, within his poetic manner, and within his self-effacing manner, which was never really self-effacing, critique, which calls me as a Jew, who am I? Now we have this representation of the Jewish prophetic to Jews. By the way, the boats to Gaza, I've written about that years ago, was the same thing. It was a provocation. It was saying, where are you, Jews? What happened to you? We need you. And the response often was violence. But now today, within the context of the war, and before that a bit, you have the rebirth of the prophetic that's come home, Jews of conscience, battling what I call Constantinian Jews, and even progressive Jews, which I consider to be the left wing of Constantinian Judaism. So Berrigan was way ahead of his time. The other thing about Berrigan is he loved provocation. When I invited him to Maryknoll, he loved coming to Maryknoll because Maryknoll was the center of liberation theology in North America. And Berrigan, I think not correctly and not totally incorrectly, thought that liberation theology sponsored violence, armed revolt, which it actually didn't, but he loved poking at it because it gave him a platform to talk about his total nonviolence.
Well, I think all of those frameworks are helpful to have us think about provocation, lament, and then those questions you offered of who are you and where are you going and where are we going? I think they're all they challenge all of us. I'm curious in closing, jumping from looking at Berrigan to the current context, if there's anything that you find in this speech that speaks to the current context in the struggle for Palestinian freedom.
Well, the current context has gone beyond anything I could have imagined. What's happening in Gaza, it's happened before in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, and Gaza, no question. But what's happening today in Gaza is beyond. I don't know if Berrigan understood that it could happen that way. We'd have to parse his words. But it certainly seems that he saw it coming or saw it already there, and he would have certainly spoke out about it again against it today. But in my experience, writing a Jewish theology of liberation and keeping on it for basically 40 years, I've never experienced anything like this. It's beyond anything, totally beyond anything. It's I don't even know how to describe it in words. I'm writing about it every day and painting it every day in my own way. But really, it's the end, what I call the end of ethical Jewish history. Now, I've been writing about the end of ethical Jewish history for a long time, but now that's the seal. Jews can't claim to have a moral center or an ethical center. Now we have Jews of conscience. Berrigan knew some of them, and Berrigan would be glad to know others. And he evidently identified me with that when I was 21. I don't know why he did, or that I could become that. But it's remarkable how the prophetic, which has been dismissed and penalized by the Constantinian Jewish establishment, has undergone a growth and an explosion in our time, and especially after October 7th.
Marc, I really appreciate your words, and we'll bring you back for the longer conversation or the interactive conversation. I wonder, in closing, was there anything about this speech that, in finding it again, in reading it again, that you found challenging or that you found unhelpful in your analysis or in his?
Well, he does touch upon the Holocaust in a very reverential way. And I know why Jews needed empowerment. And I'm not a pacifist. And I could have a dialogue with Berrigan, but when I went with him to the discussion with Rubenstein, he wouldn't even look at Rubenstein. I remember that very much. I can see why the Jewish establishment was furious with Berrigan, and the Jewish left was furious with him then, and might still be furious with him, because when others claim to be Jews, it really pisses off Jews. But I understand it as a lament. It's a powerful lament, because he feels bereft without that anchor of the Jewish prophetic, which is the root of the global prophetic. So for me as a Jew, I didn't find anything offensive, but I hope to be a Jew of conscience and can read it through the lens of through that lens. And of course, I know Catholic life quite well through my experience at the Catholic Worker and Maryknoll, and through meeting him. But it's a non-starter in the Jewish community historically, maybe even today, because of this claim. But Edward Said made the same claim, the great Palestinian thinker and activist. Where are you? What happened to you? We need you.
And those are challenging questions indeed. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate you kicking off our conversation here. I am going to bring Huwaida in and ask some similar questions. There we go. There we are. Hi, Huwaida. Yeah, I think I'm curious of asking a similar question to you that I asked Mark. If you could share a little bit about your context as a person, as a thinker, that affect how you read this speech or how you came to this speech.
Thanks, John. Good evening, everyone. Well, I did not have the good fortune to get to know, to even meet Father Berrigan, but certainly his work and, has touched me, and I've worked with people who have worked with him. And so the opportunity to be here tonight and to then go back and in preparation read this speech certainly brought to mind a number of things. I agree, it's extremely prophetic and so relevant today. The things that jumped out at me and how I read them is that this is a speech given in 1973, and he is talking about colonialism and that Israel undertook basically a colonial project. And I'm thinking to today and how we are in our words and in our advocacy trying to explain that Israel is a settler colonial project. And this is something he spoke about, he knew 50 years ago. Of course, wasn't the only one, and there are Palestinian thinkers and writers who were talking that way, but then we so digress that when I was living and working in the occupied Palestinian territory in 2000, 2001, and I was working with Palestinian communities in resisting nonviolently Israel's aggression and settler colonial policies, in trying to communicate to the media what we're doing, we had to fight with the media to just even say, Israel's occupying, this is occupied territory. It was always like disputed territory. So at some point, we got to a general kind of recognition, at least in the media. I mean, of course, in international law, it's recognized as occupied territory, and there's no question there. But Israel has so kind of obfuscated that, and the mainstream Western media went along with it. And for a long time, it's just disputed territory. And it wasn't even settlements that they would call them. They would call Israeli settlements, honestly, if you guys remember back then, Jewish neighborhoods. But occupation, what we kind of fought for back 20 years ago, is only a part of what's happening, right? The Israeli military occupation is just one part of actually how Israel is carrying out this settler colonial project. And it is what really something that has been done progressively more violent than it was, that and with total impunity, that brought us to today. And I witnessed it in the years that I lived in the occupied territory. It was Israel would always in their actions kind of push the limits of what they can do. And when there is no repercussions, next time the next assault would be even more egregious, even more. And then again, just impunity, a little bit of maybe hand slapping, some harsh words here and there, but no consequences. And then Israel escalates and continues to escalate. And so in explaining that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide, obviously not just since October 7th, but before that, it is part of a settler colonial project, which is intended to wipe out or replace the indigenous population. And so some of the things we've been talking about is showing, for example, a map of what Palestine has become and how Palestinians have been moved into such smaller and smaller areas of land, making it very difficult for Palestinians to continue to exist. So they look to leave. And that's in addition to the policies that, the killings that have gone on and the expulsions and all of the people that have been kicked out and exiled. And when you have a settler colonial project, you either replace the inhabitants, you commit a genocide or a mass expulsion, or you have a situation, the people that you don't get rid of apartheid. And that's also something that Palestinians have been saying for decades. Berrigan didn't talk about it in his speech, but Palestinians have been saying it. And over the last few years, international human rights organizations have been saying it. And so it is all very much connected. And so we have to understand that. And what's frustrating is that the leaders, the United States and these countries, and when they're talking about the day after and what next and what the solution is, it's always kind of bringing it back to there must be a two-state solution as the only way, instead of recognizing that before you talk about any solutions or what any boundaries can be or what kind of states you have to talk about a process of decolonizing. You have to, in South Africa, it was dismantling apartheid, right? You can't, and yet that there is an absolute still refusal amongst the world leaders, as you call it, to recognize that. And this was something, again, that Father Berrigan spoke about over 50 years ago. And yet that is the work that a lot of, and me as an activist and trying to educate on what's happening in mobilizing, need people to understand. Another thing that kind of jumped out at me, and Marc talked about it a little bit, is the way in which, and I think you too touched on it, John, in how much Father Berrigan was actually talking about, the essence of the Jewish people and what they gave the world. Thou shalt not kill, the Jewish soul, if you will, the compassion, caring for the poor, this having the moral high ground, or as a people, a religion that is known to and should have the moral high ground. I mean, and talked about the religion as something that is great, and completely distinguished that from the state and what Israel is doing. And yet he was still attacked, by the Jewish establishment in the United States, or the Zionist establishment, and it called anti-Semitic, and called his speech actually classical theological anti-Semitism. And that brings to today, and what has been happening for decades, of course, this conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, or criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, which is completely inaccurate and wrong, but done deliberately to protect Israel, right? So that you don't criticize Israel. And that, and it just touched on me, or it just stood out to me, how he took care to actually elevate the Jewish tradition and separate that, as Marc said, saying what happened to you, and it's actually a shame. And I think in a few lines that I had marked here, he said, it's a tragedy beyond calculating that the state of Israel should become the repository and finally the tomb of the Jewish soul. That in place of Jewish compassion, Israel should legislate armaments and yet more armaments. That in place of Jewish compassion for the poor and forgotten, Israel should legislate evictions, uprootings, destruction of goods, imprisonment, terrorism. That in place of Jewish peaceableness, Israel should legislate a law of expanding violence. That in place of Jewish prophetic wisdom, Israel should launch an Orwellian nightmare of double talk, racism, fifth-rate sociological jargon aimed at proving its racial superiority to the people it has crushed. So that kind of really stood out to me in that distinction, and saying what Israel has become is not what the Jewish people you would expect have made it. And yet with that was still criticized as being anti-Semitic, just has continued to where we are today. And it has worked for so many years in making people afraid to speak up for the, because nobody wants to be called anti-Semitic. And the last thing I will mention before I kind of turn it back to you to see what other questions you want to ask is, I think towards the last paragraph where he has a message for the Arab people specifically, or a criticism. And it in a way is kind of calling Palestinians and Arabs to utilize nonviolent tactics. And that honestly is something I've heard for many, many years from very well-meaning people. And of course, you understand it. But it also sometimes comes, and I'm not sure with Father Berrigan, but in a lot of instances, it comes from people who don't necessarily know the history of Palestinian nonviolence, because we only see the violent tactics, right? Because that's everything else is ignored. Our decades and decades, in the early 1900s, 1920s, the organizing that we did, not the nonviolent resistance, the 1936 Arab boycott, and throughout, through our expulsion in 1948 and everything after, our first intifada, which was after a speech in 1987, even when I myself learned about some of the organizing that the people on the ground under a brutal military occupation did to resist their colonizers, it was something I had never learned about. I studied Martin Luther King and I studied Gandhi, but you don't study Palestinian nonviolent resistance. And so when I went to first live in the occupied Palestinian territory, and I was coming from this tradition in the United States and growing up, and how wonderful, and the civil rights movement, and what you learned about Martin Luther King and how powerful that was, and I wanted to do something like that in the occupied Palestinian territory. And that's when I had to get schooled myself about the history of my people's nonviolent resistance, and why a lot of the forces that make people kind of give up on this kind of unarmed resistance. I mean, when you go through years and decades of this kind of resistance, to be crushed, to be killed, to be dispossessed, and to see your brutalizer not face any consequences, and on top of that, you being blamed for the violence, you being blamed for your own death, Palestinians look at other means of survival, because the ultimate of Israel's the settler colonial project is to get Palestinians off the land. So it's about whatever we can do to stay on the land. And then those that believe that, and in every society, you believe that, you fight fire with fire, and that believe more in violent resistance, those forces are empowered, or they carry it out. And then suddenly everything, Palestinians do is just terror, and Israel is justified in whatever it does. And that's kind of what we have today after October 7th. People just want to look at that and want to look at, Hamas and saying Hamas is terrible, not recognizing at all what the conditions that the people live in, what Hamas is saying, just looking at a few tactics, and that it's a terrorist organization, and therefore Israel is justified, leaves us in the situation where it is almost accepted, or the leaders that for certain domestic considerations in their own countries maintain this ironclad commitment and support of the Israeli state, will use just kind of Hamas as a convenient excuse. And I think, of course, that probably most of us look past that. If anyone wants to get into a further conversation about that, I'm happy to. But it's, while I practiced and believe in unarmed resistance, I will not and don't condemn armed resistance. Of course, I'm absolutely opposed to in every way. You go targeting civilians is always wrong. But I think we have to also engage in that kind of talk and these conversations because of the narrative that has been built up that has vilified Palestinians and Palestinian resistance. And so again, I don't know where Father Berrigan was coming from or if he knows the history. And some of the things that he suggested are things that we have been doing. I mean, when he talked about also the boats sailing to the shores and demanding a right of return. I mean, I was part of organizing these boats, but before I was the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1989, I believe, organized the boat, and Israel blew it up. Israel blew it up. So Palestinians can be nonviolent and have been all they want and have still been killed. And Palestinians aren't afraid to die for their liberation. It's not, we're not doing nonviolence because we're going to be killed. It's because nobody, the years and the decades of it hasn't shown Palestinians that it works in any way. Unfortunately, Israel still gets away with it. It is that kind of impunity. So let me stop there and
thank you so much. I think it's a prophetic reminder that not only should we have maybe asked you to read Dan Berrigan's speech, given how well you did with it, but that there's a prophetic answer to that question. Where is this certain type of resistance? And that when particularly Western peacemakers in the US ask that question, we should look at the history first, and we should be deepened in that. And I wonder with that, if there's anything that speaks in this speech to you to that current context. You talked about the naming of settler colonialism, and you also brought in the realities of occupation and apartheid. And I wonder if there's anything in this speech that you see that could speak or not speak to these realities.
You know, aside from kind of what I said, I take very much his and appreciate his criticism of the people that benefit and profit from world leaders to the fiddlers he was talking about, that, you know, perhaps the images, and like today, perhaps the images coming out of Gaza are an inconvenient truth for some people, but we have forces that are fine with it continuing. Perhaps they would like the, you know, images to not be so brutal, and but otherwise for their own kind of benefits and for their own interests and for their own kind of conquests, and other don't really mind. And so what we need to do to change that dynamic, and it's not necessarily in this speech, but in other speeches of his, is in terms of what we need to do as a community and what we need to sacrifice for a better world. And I am, you know, deeply indebted to him, is not only for what he sacrificed and what he stood for and everything he's done, but that he did it from a place of, you know, from being a man of the cloth, let's say, because, and I said this last night actually at a talk at the church, I was raised Catholic, you know, Christian, and specifically on Palestine, but also in many other instances also of injustice, I'm so profoundly disappointed in the church, and just the kind of comfort that we take in talking about what Jesus would do, but not acting in how Jesus would or in his teachings. And that has really caused a crisis of faith within myself. But he worked from that to send a different message and to model. Whereas for me, I'm not there, at least in terms of organized religion. And perhaps that's a weak position for me, and I need to work more forcefully within those organized religious spaces. But it is a level of hypocrisy that we see kind of all of the time that is a powerful force. I think it's a little bit demoralizing to have principles, especially when it comes from a religious place, but also, again, for me as an international human rights lawyer, and to have the law hijacked or our religion hijacked to serve purposes that aren't for the betterment of people, or aren't for the protection and the equality and the life and dignity of people, but quite the opposite. It's a challenge in how we organize to confront that, because there are such big forces that are at play to keep things in the way they are, and to continue to use these words and to manipulate these principles to push agendas that aren't agendas that serve the people. Sorry, that wasn't your question exactly, but that's kind of
It's
what came
great.
to mind.
Do you have anything else on that? It was great. No worries. I'll close with the same question I did to Marc before I bring him back in. Was there anything in the speech that you found either challenging or unhelpful, that maybe, to use Marc's term, was a challenge more than it was a lament, or was a provocation that you found yourself pushing back on?
No, not really, except the kind of the first thing that I talked about in terms of the call to Palestinians, or the critique of Arabs, and maybe a call to them to utilize these nonviolent tactics in the methods of, or in the tradition of Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Chavez and whatnot. It wasn't necessarily a critique, but something that I found important to comment on and to recognize. But as far as anything else, no, honestly.
And I think in your life's work and in the work of so many other Palestinian freedom fighters, it's a question answered. I think at the end he says, what if you went door to door demanding a ceasefire, or taking boats to their door, or doing these things, and those things are happening. And I appreciate you bringing that to the center of our conversation. I'm gonna bring Marc back in here. Again, thank you so much to both of you for bringing your perspectives. This is a key commitment of the Daniel Berrigan Collective, is to bring Father Berrigan's work into conversation, literal conversation, with thinkers like each of you. I wonder if either of you have questions for each other about each of your responses, or wonderings about each of the frameworks that you brought, that you might want to know more about hearing from the other speaker.
I do. I could ask Professor Ellis first. And it's a big question, but because of your work and the decades that you have kind of studied Judaism, and even kind of the society, Israeli and in the broader Jewish society, I think where we are today and what we see news coming out of Israel, and in myself thinking, like my thinking is the future is integrated. The future has to be one in where we all kind of live together as equals. That's how I've always seen it. But now you have, according to what I've been reading, a situation where 94% of Israeli Jews think that the force that Israel is using in Gaza is appropriate, is just fine. And a lot of the other kind of vitriol, just horrific things that we are reading coming out of Israeli Jewish society in terms of Gaza. Where do we, how long will it take to fix, how do we work with that?
Well, I think too, we have to factor in something as horrific, that when it's all done and there is a ceasefire and there are rumors of this and that, the normalization of Israel within the Middle East will go on. It's not going to be that this is a stopping point. My own sense is that we're at the end of ethical Jewish history. Okay, that's gone. There are some Jews who carry it forth. But this kind of violence, which has been repeated over and over again, as you've said, in this long but short history, has now accelerated to a point that is really unreal, and it's all over the world. It's visualized. The New York Times has photos, maps. I mean, everybody knows it. And I was listening yesterday, and I was asked to write something which I'm writing today and about the day after. That's going to be horrific. All of this will be forgotten, which happens so often in history, right? And Israel will assume its normal role in the Middle East and will be further integrated. And no one's going to pull the plug on Israel. And there was a Saudi official at Davos who said that, okay, now the only way we're going to go forward is for the movement toward a Palestinian state. No details. None of them are interested, and this is why I've also written for years that Palestinians are on the other side of history. Everybody wants to contain them. Nobody wants them to be free. In reality, I don't mean in rhetoric. So they are on the other side of history, as Jews were. So this is as disturbing as what's going on is what will happen after. There'll be billions of dollars put into Gaza, et cetera, and rebuilt in its own way. And how long that will take is, that's going to take a long time. But in the end, when Israel signs a deal with Hamas, really, whether they say so or not, and Hamas is being sheltered in Arab countries, and you're correct in saying that Hamas is not just a, quote, terrorist organization, it's a political movement. So they will survive, or others will survive, to continue the resistance, and we'll go on from there.
I mean, I must say, I agree that there will be a movement to continue to normalize Israel in the Middle East, irrespective of what happens with the Palestinians, and that has been going on for a very long time. But that is unacceptable, and I think that many of us think the horrors of what we have been seeing and the magnitude of it has to be a turning point, that it just can't go on as you have said. And kind of the one part of me thinks is horrified by that thought, because again, Palestinians won't be free, and there is still, and yes, there is talk about what the day after is, and not including Palestinians, right? Who is going to do that? Who is going to do what? And it has to, and I think today there was a headline in that, any future for the PLO means PLO has to detach itself from Hamas, or all of these kind of conditions being put on it, and not recognizing the Palestine, what happens and what is the future has to include Palestinians. It is their decision to make and not anybody else's. And I don't think that we can accept anything less than that. And I think that we're working now very hard, right, to get a ceasefire just to protect lives. That is the bare minimum ceasefire now. But after that, the work cannot in any way kind of dissipate or even slow down, because then these forces again are going to come back in and create the same kind of situations where Palestinians are not free and Israel is normalized. And that is going to just lead to more violence in the future, and certainly, again, with Palestinians being denied their freedom. So it is incumbent upon us, I think, and anybody that cares about freedom, peace, and justice, to not accept that. And I know that I have pledged that none of this will go away. None of this will be erased. And then my children and my grandchildren will make sure that Biden's grandchildren are ashamed of where he stood during the Palestinian genocide. Like, we cannot let it go, as you said. And I was listening to Professor Ilan Pappé a couple of weeks ago, where he said he firmly believes that this is the beginning of the end of the of Israel's settler colonial project. Now, what that means, I don't know, but he kind of saw this as the beginning of the end of that project. And of course, this doesn't mean Jews being wiped out, but it does mean a dismantling of this and envisioning something that is more just, which means that normalization with an entity like Israel without Palestinians being completely liberated is absolutely unacceptable, and we have to fight that.
I hear you. But if you're asking me what my view is, that's a different. So I don't want to encourage anybody. The sad part of it is we've heard this over and over and over and over again. Now you think, and I've heard it from Ilan forever, too. And you think this has gone way over the line. And I hope you're right.
Marc, I wonder in the same way if you had questions for Huwaida after hearing some of her reflections on Dan Berrigan's speech.
No, I don't have questions. I listen intently and with respect, because this is a challenge to Palestinians and the Arab world and to Jews and everybody else. So it's not a matter of questions, it's listening. And unfortunately, I've been right without knowing all the details too often on this since I wrote Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation. And my hope is exactly like hers also on the Jewish side and the Jewish Civil War, that it would end, but it won't end. So I don't want to sound pessimistic, and I don't want to put a damper on anyone's thought, including younger folks who are challenging the situation, which I am too. But I'm in a listening position. I think Palestinians have every right to hope and to struggle and to resist, just the way she said, and not condemn armed resistance, even though taking a perspective on what that armed resistance can be. In fact, years ago, I proposed that the US troops in Iraq should be sent to the borders, the 67 borders of Israel, and to drive Israel back to those borders. That wasn't received too well. So I'm not a pacifist. But my prediction is that Israel, once it stops, will be invited in even deeper into the Middle East security zone. The world will be called upon to supply and rebuild Gaza, and Palestinians will not forget, and Jews of conscience will not forget, but the world will move on. This is the saddest part of history, and I don't want to be pessimistic. I'm just trying to understand. So the question is, what do you do within that? Within my framework, and you can't simply, I don't think you can simply say, I can't accept that framework. Because we know it's happened again and again and again. The Palestinian Intifada, the first in 1987-88, that was a hope that we all had, and I was there often and saw the hope and felt the hope. That was supposed to be the turning point. Now that goes back many years, and we can talk about many years, and it could be that because of the increase in technology in the Arab world and elsewhere, that Israel could be destroyed. But if Israel was destroyed, it would take Palestinian lives en masse too. It's a very dangerous situation to let this happen. But if you look at the self-interest of Arab countries and Arab leaders, and not talking about the people, what's their self-interest? So I admire Huwaida very much and the whole movement of the Gaza boats, and so you have my tremendous respect. And I don't want to be a pessimist.
No, I mean, I think it's good to think of what a very possible scenario, and it is what we've seen, right? I mean, after the first Intifada and then the second Intifada, and then you had the various bombardments of Gaza and thinking things will change, and they don't. But what kind of taking a longer view from a different perspective in where I think we've come in people's understanding of
Yeah.
of what has happened and the building, in the United States, but also around the world, of alliances between kind of marginalized people on the international level, the kind of the BRICS movement, and to try to kind of end this domination of the global north. A lot of different factors, I think, plus the horrors of what we've seen, and a lot of people waking up and a lot of people using whatever skills that they have to do things in various ways. So every day we've seen the mass protests, but we've also maybe not looked at some of the other things that are being done on a technology and other level. Tomorrow, of course, we're awaiting the ICJ decision. We have another at the same time, only a couple hours later, a California court will be hearing oral argument in a case against Biden, Blinken, and Austin for support and complicity in genocide. So using the law, I have people who have woken up, who see the injustice and are committed to a change, as well as, not forgetting we have a huge nonviolent Palestinian movement that has been helping to educate, and also seeing small victories that I fully believe will also increase, and that is the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. If Israel continues on its way the way it is, continuing to build that movement and to isolate Israel in every arena until we reach a tipping point where it has to, it feels itself so isolated that will bring about a change. So it might very well, yes, and in large part because of, I think, very corrupt Arab regimes, and Father Berrigan mentions those a little bit in his speech, but that is very true. If the Arab regimes weren't as they were, for example, Egypt, I mean, the border, Rafah with Gaza, is Egypt, but Egypt doesn't open without, it won't defy Israel, right? It could, but it won't defy Israel. So Israel effectively controls it, and people in Gaza are starving because Egypt won't defy Israel to open that border and let in all of these trucks, the hundreds and more thousands of trucks that are waiting, and the 2 million people that are starving inside. So these Arab regimes are infuriating, and I don't know, we had an Arab Spring, we had hope there, and things haven't turned out much better. So that's a whole nother, I think, area of work that needs to continue. And so it's very possible their interests lie in normalizing Israel, and I absolutely believe that they will continue to kind of go in that way. And will their populations be able to, in the anger that has been generated from everything that we've seen, will the people be able to stop it? And whatever kind of happens there, we have to continue our global movement and building and working on the ground until we build the power necessary. I think that we have no other choice, is my view on that.
Yes, and then since I started working on this, I can see your point. Even among Jews, the number of Jews, no question. So I hear you, and I'm listening. I wish I could sign on, but yes, you are quite right about all of these movements. Unfortunately, so far, which doesn't mean forever, these movements have helped to enable Israel in a very interesting way, because Israel plays its own cards in a brilliant way. So far, 9/11 helped Israel. The divestment movement has helped Israel. As you isolate Israel, its power connections with the West especially, and now with the Arab world, increase, if you've noticed. Now, there may be a breaking point. If this isn't it, my God, what could be? I mean, they have systematically destroyed, I mean, beyond anything. So what you're saying about the increase, but even now with it hitting back on campuses in the United States, Harvard, Penn, MIT, other places, known and unknown or little known. I just got word that one of my congregational members or fellow members resigned from a position in Florida because she was being harassed to the hilt because of her participation in movement toward justice for a Jew. So that still exists, and there are more people on campus, including Palestinians, who are really, yeah. So I don't want to go on and on. I hear you. I've experienced it. I hope you're right.
Huwaida, I wonder if even with that eye to the sobering realities that we live in, I wonder, as someone who works in those movements and works for what Marc was calling those breaking points that we have to get to for change, where you see where we might move and where you talked about BDS, you talked about the flotilla, you talked about things you've been involved in, but maybe where you're seeing those breaking points breaking forward.
Well, I mean, I think certain breaking points will come once more people know, right? And once more people realize that what they've been fed or what they have been raised to believe is not true. And in that sense, that kind of work too is continuing and has been, although there is very much an environment of repression here, people aren't, I don't believe a lot of people are giving into that. And we have, especially on college campuses, where the movement is very vibrant and it is being repressed, but students are fighting back and they have resources today that we didn't have before. For example, an organization that is completely dedicated to fighting to protect the constitutional rights of people who speak up and are persecuted or punished for speaking up for Palestinian rights, and that's Palestine Legal. So they fight some of the legal battles. And although it's a small organization, they've also had countless attorneys around the country volunteer, like step up, we'll do pro bono work. We're not going to let, McCarthyism 2.0 set in again here, and we have to fight this kind of repression. And I think that there's also a backlash to the repression, for example, with the stepping down of the Harvard president, for example, and what Bill Ackerman and his money and what had to do with it. So people questioning now the power and influence of big money in universities and in silencing free speech and whatnot. So I think actually that backfires on the people that are pushing this kind of silencing. And we will see whether it is big and in your face kind of action or just people in their own kind of small communities, wherever they are, doing small education on Palestine. The alliances are being built, and we see that with the younger generation, right? We see the polling specifically in the United States of where the younger generation is, younger voters, they call them in the polls that are being done, are on Palestine. And that is the future. It's not maybe the immediate future, but that's the hope that I look forward to. And then so we have to continue building our capacity to continue to educate and to reach out. And the resources are there and they're developing. And personally, I see that a lot of the silencing tactics that have been used are not working, and people who are afraid or wondering what to do have support and do have resources and a community of support to do the work that they feel that they should, but maybe were too afraid to do before. So it might not be a change tomorrow, but I think it will come a breaking point because the information is there. The stories are there, and the number of eyes that have been opened and that we will continue to work to keep opening is the dedication to doing that is there. I think maybe I'm too naive, but we have to believe that We have to have some hope, and we have to continuously believe that it's like on the horizon to keep reaching for it.
Thanks, Huwaida. And for clarity for our audience, Marc is not staging a nonviolent walkout protest. He mentioned to us that some health issues might have him coming to and fro at different points. But I think it's, oh, go ahead, Huwaida.
Sorry, one thing I wanted to mention too, in some of the work that's being done, you know, I was with the International Solidarity Movement, and one of the things that we did, of course, we invited people from all over the world to come to the occupied Palestinian territory and see what is happening with their own eyes. So to get past what we are fed, especially in the United States, and thousands upon thousands of people have done that over the years, and then they go back to their home communities and they're doing the work. It's not only through the ISM, but other programs. For example, I'm involved with Eyewitness Palestine, which does delegations and very powerful delegations. But I bring that up because the ability to connect in different ways now and to see with your own eyes what's happening is possible. I really encourage people to do that, but also to put in a plug for one of the things we need with the International Solidarity Movement is what's happening in Gaza is horrific. And as Marc said, beyond what I think most people could have ever imagined, horror. But also what's happening in the West Bank is beyond what has ever happened before. We hear about it less, but on average, 3 to 4 people being killed, shot dead every day in the West Bank. Villages depopulated, mass arrests, just horror. And one of the things that the ISM is doing there is trying to provide a protective presence. Just having, you know, either Israeli anti-occupation activists or internationals from around the world, just having a few people in villages can be a deterrent to violent settlers or military raids and whatnot. And so if anyone's thinking of like to travel to the occupied Palestinian territory, hit me up, please.
Thank you. If our speakers and our audience will humor me at going to 5 past our intended 8:30 mark, I think we'll have time for maybe one question. I apologize to our audience, but it was a rich conversation. We wanted to get to it. And then, Huwaida, I'll give you and Marc one more opportunity to share things that you might want to promote, like you said, that folks can get involved in. And then we will close us out at 35. So we don't have our chat available, but I'm wondering if folks are able to signal with a hand, and we will do our best to unmute you, and it will be picked at random, just in interest of time. I'm very sorry. I see a hand from Mary Ann. Mary Ann, I'm gonna ask you to unmute here.
Oh my God, what an honor to be with you all. Bill, Huwaida. Huwaida and I knew each other back in 2008. Oh my God. So real quickly, and Marc, thank you, everybody, the whole thing. And then dear friends on the call, Paul. And so my thought was, I think there's some major differences in terms of the history. We've never had social media. We've never been able to see the horrors be revealed to us in real time before. And when I think about the Iraq War, if we had the social media that we have now, we would things would have changed on the ground, I think, in the United States. That's one thing. But the other thing is just looking at the implosion of the Israeli state or in the Israeli community because of what Netanyahu and the far right extremists are about, and the fact that they're dragging everybody, including the hostages, down the drain because of this grand scheme of clearing out all Palestinians from the river to the sea. I think I wondered if you could talk about that. That we see, you know, the hostage families going after Netanyahu's residence and being in the streets for this. Not to say that they're doing it on behalf of Palestinian liberation, but the fact that their economy has been reduced. There's so many more deaths that the hospitals in Israel can't contain because of so many of the soldiers and injuries, the deaths of people. Anyway, I'd love to hear some of your comments about that. As a different.
Huwaida, Marc, thoughts on any of those items?
Well, I think the landscape has changed, as Huwaida has said, very much over the, and that includes what was just suggested. So there's no question. I mean, I even have rabbis who read my work. They used to persecute me, and there would still be many who do. It's a big change in the Jewish community, but Israel is not dependent on Jewish support. I know that sounds weird. And Biden has been giving a red light and a green light the whole time. And we have all this technology and all, and it has changed, and including in Israel, I agree with you all. So your point, and Huwaida's point are very, very good. And I may be out of touch, so please forgive me.
Wait, oh, go ahead, Mark.
No, I don't think it's not out of touch at all. I think, yes, there is internal in Israel discontent and a blaming of Netanyahu for everything that happened, for the lives of the hostages, for the security failure on October 7th. If it was a security failure, obviously we know that the government was given notice that something was happening. So we have yet to see really all of the facts to come out there. But definitely Netanyahu is not popular at all. Internal dissent on, but that necessarily doesn't give me any kind of optimism in terms of Israeli society or Israel as a state behaving any better, because of, the cabinet still filled with or without Netanyahu, these right-wingers who were elected by Israeli society. And as I said earlier, 94% of Israeli society think what Israel is doing in Gaza is absolutely kind of correct, and an appropriate amount of force is there. And for the years that I was there, I saw always consistently a small group of anti-apartheid Israeli activists coming to work with us, but they were always marginalized, kind of marginalized in their own community. I don't want to say vilified, but yeah, attacked as being, traitors and whatnot. So there hasn't been, Israeli society as a whole has become much more fanatic, much more set in their kind of supremacist Arab Palestinian hating, unfortunately, ideology. And whether Netanyahu, if Netanyahu's gone, good for them in some sense, but if someone who's going to come across as more of a moderate, but not necessarily kind of change the whole ethos of what the state is built on, it's not really going to be any better and not going to get us to where we need to go. So I don't necessarily see an implosion. I see a crisis within Israel kind of itself because of Netanyahu, but I don't see it getting any better by replacing Netanyahu. And I see as like my big problem with, or the question I start off with Mark, just how extremist Israeli society has become is, you have the settlers, of course, on rampages, but you have most of Israeli society. You have, yesterday I heard some, young Israeli refuseniks refusing to go into the military. You've always had that, a small number of people. And right now it's even a smaller number of people. So you always have those people, but that movement within Israel has never been able to really kind of take hold, and very marginalized, and that kind of hatred and supremacist ideology and absolute, get rid of all the Palestinians, I think is there. And that is a problem. And that is going to, I'm not sure that it's going to take a lot of work. I don't see necessarily much hope there myself personally, unfortunately.
Well, thank you, Huwaida. Thank you, Mark. I'm going to close us out with a few notes and then a quick call to action, well, several call to actions. I'm going to have us do a little round robin with it. I think that note to end on was important because both Huwaida and Mark, you've had us sit, as Mark brought us at the beginning, you've had us sit in very real lament about where we are. And you've offered us, on the other end of that poll that Mark brought forward, you've each offered us provocation. And I mean that in the most positive sense of the word. You've provoked us to dream, both with an eye to reality, but with deep, deep hope that there is a reality beyond the horrors of settler colonialism and occupation and apartheid and supremacist ideology, and that hope lies in the Palestinian movement for freedom and in the work that the Palestinian people do in that movement for freedom. And it is that movement that will bring us all to a safer, more peaceful world. So I want to thank both of you so much for what you brought us here tonight with this conversation. I am so grateful. I know that the steering committee is so grateful, and the whole Daniel Berrigan collective community is grateful. I'm going to end us with one call to action. In my work at Pax Christi USA, I am the fundraising person, which usually gets people to flee a room. But we will do a follow-up email to the folks who were here tonight. It will have a link to give to the work of the Daniel Berrigan Collective. We are a very small collective, so everything you can give does help us do our work. And we do run on small donations so that we can pay speakers like Huwaida and Marc in great gratitude for the work that they've done in being with us here tonight. So that said, my call to action out of the way, I will move to Huwaida, then Marc, then Kathy to see if there are specific call to actions that you'd like to offer, places that people can get involved, can give, can continue to do the work that you've brought us tonight. Huwaida.
Oh my gosh, it's hard to summarize because there is a lot going on, and that is wonderful. And it reminds me too of something that I heard Father Berrigan say, or someone talk about what he said when he was actually encouraging resistance to Vietnam, and even encouraging action that would get people arrested. And so somebody said, well, we have kids. Right? What's going to happen to our kids if we get arrested? And his response was, what's going to happen to them if you don't? In terms of the world that we are trying to create and what we can do to create that world. And that is not to say, let's go out and get arrested, everybody. If you can, let's disrupt everything. But there is it's part of my firm belief that there is something for everybody to do. You know, I mentioned being in the occupied Palestinian territory. If you can go, please, John, feel free to share my contact information with somebody. We might be organizing another flotilla soon, but there is something happening on a local level, people bringing resolutions to their city council, to their school boards, and people calling their legislators every single day. So we have moved from 13 Congress people to now 72 calling for a ceasefire. So if you can't get out and march and you can't get arrested, you can pick up a phone and call your legislator. So just find out where you can get where you're comfortable, and even if you're slightly not comfortable, pushing yourself a little bit just to be doing something every single day. That's all.
Thank you, Huwaida. Marc?
Well, because of my age and other realities, I'm confined to my couch. What I've been doing is writing every day and painting every day and posting. Very small, humble. But I agree with Huwaida that everyone has something to contribute to the movement. I have 2 kids who are contributing in different ways too. And I used to go around the world contributing in my own way. And there are many others now. And I agree with Huwaida about that. So that's, and what she said about doing things in activism, I certainly agree with. And then one day, you know, Martin Buber said that history was a history of prophetic failure until one day history opened up. And that's what I hear in Huwaida's voice, and I love that voice. And I see it in my kids and others, of course. And I want to listen to that and spread it around, as long as we keep in mind the difficulties too, and how we have to work through the realities with our hope. So I'm very, very glad that you invited me to participate, to get closer again to Father Berrigan, to meet Huwaida, which I hadn't met. And
that when I was in college, we invited you to, in my Arab student group, we invited you to speak, but that was a long time ago. And you probably don't remember. I was at the University of Michigan.
oh, I do. Well, I University of Michigan. I remember, and if I might take a moment, I remember one startling aspect of that. I was there several times. When I gave a talk, the place was packed, as I remember it.
Mhm.
And everyone left afterwards. People came up, and there was one Jewish student who stood in front of me. And I said, "Can I help you?" He said, "I've never heard a voice like that. What can I do?" So thank you for inviting me. Actually, I remember it.
Oh, great. Yes.
Kathy, would you like to give us one small hope, one small opening in history that that we can concretely do?
Well, actually, I have two very small openings. In addition to being on the steering committee of the Daniel Berrigan Collective, I'm also on the National Council for Pax Christi USA, I just would like everybody to know that Pax Christi USA is very involved in this struggle, has been for a very long time, and we have a Palestinian solidarity working group. And we would love more members. So please go, if you're interested, please go to the Pax Christi USA website. And there's information on the website on how to get involved in the Palestinian Solidarity Working Group. Second, there is, I don't know if folks noticed, but last week, I actually posted it. It was a bit of a joke I posted to my Instagram account. How do you know when the Christians who are shutting down the Capitol are Mennonites? And the answer was they bring quilts. So, but the Mennonites actually have gotten organized in a major way. And now they're trying to organize other Christians, which is also really wonderful. And I was on an organizing call this past Monday, and I believe it only had like 48 hours notice, and we had 100 people. So our next goal is to have a call on February 15th, the day after Ash Wednesday. It'll be from 8 until 9:30 Eastern Time. And you can find the link to sign up if you Google Christians Against Genocide. That will take you to the Action Network page where you can sign up. Our goal is to get 1,000 people, and we're already at 165, and it's only been a couple days. So we have some work to do, but I think we're going to get there, and I'm really excited about this effort. The call that I was on was really well done, and there's just so much really wonderful energy to push back against the Christian Zionists and to really try to move the needle here.
Well, thank you, Kathy. Again, thank you, Huwaida. Thank you, Marc. I don't want to keep folks any longer than we already have, but it was for a rich and powerful and important conversation. So good night to everyone from the collective. Speakers, if you want to hang on for just 2 minutes, I promise we got to get your information to make sure we get you paid. So thank you.